So everyone, my name is Christine Hong. I am the director, the co-director of a new Center for Racial Justice um, on the UC Santa Cruz campus. I am currently also the director of a program in critical race and ethnic studies. And I'm so pleased to welcome you to today's event and to welcome our honored guest, Deep Singh. And Talib will be introducing our guest in just a moment, but I wanted to first begin by thanking the uh, Sarbjit Singh Arora Endowed Chair in Sikh and Punjabi Studies, in addition to the CRJ and CRES for supporting this event. And I wanted to say too that this event was organized in conjunction with a course, CRES 70S, its Introduction to the Sikhs, that Professor Nirvikar Singh of Economics inaugurated so generously at the very inception of CRES several years ago. That class is now being taught by a graduate student in literature and press, Talib Jabbar, who will be speaking in just a moment. And I want to also say that it was a number of years ago that Professor Nirvikar Singh generously introduced me to Deep Chan, who is an amazing community organizer. And so what I'd like to do right now is yield the floor to Talib and just say one quick other note about the format of this webinar. What we will be doing is uh, we will have Q&A, and I believe, I see that the chat is working, but what we'd like for you to do is actually to input your questions into the Q&A function, and those will be moderated, and we will go over those during the Q&A for about the last half hour of this webinar. But Talib, would you mind introducing our guest? Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Christine, and welcome everyone. So yeah, I have the privilege of actually introducing our honored speaker today. Naindeep Singh Chan is the executive director of the Jakarta movement, which is the nation's largest Punjabi Sikh youth organizing and base building organization. It's dedicated to educational justice, immigrant rights, resident empowerment, and civic engagement. The Jakarta movement attempts to combine theory and praxis in building new forms of power and redistributing power to marginalized and vulnerable communities in the Central Valley here in California. He also currently serves as a school board trustee member for Central Unified in Fresno County. And Deep's had a long history of organizing around issues related to Sikhs in California, including during his time at UCLA, where he organized its first Sikh student association. He's also, as Christine was saying, has links with UC Santa Cruz, where he's been in discussion with distinguished Professor Nirvikar Singh, who, as Christine mentioned, inaugurated the course that I'm currently teaching, where we explore racial histories of Sikhs with a focus on the Californian diaspora. It's the first course of its kind in the UC system and aims to establish and expand Sikh studies as a field. So I really personally, I see Deep's work as an extension and interaction with the aims of that course and with Sikh studies more generally. His work goes beyond intellectually thinking about Sikh life and communities to actually, addressing the histories that are so evident in the tensions that we see today. So, today, hopefully, his talk will allow us to reflect a little bit about how we ourselves can engage our intellectual curiosities into forms of action. So with that, Deep, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Talib and Christine for hosting me today. I mean, this is quite an honor and been much time in the making. Neither a pandemic nor anything else was going to stop this from happening. So I want to really send my appreciation to the two of you, and really want to welcome all of the students, really looking forward to our conversation, the different questions we're going to be raising and talking about. Really, this is meant in some ways to be kind of a conversation. There are ways that hopefully I get to explore some history. Some you may know, some you may not. But really is that, you know, here we are when we talk about white supremacy, you know, in some ways, it has entered at least the national dialogue in a big way since January 6th, but for racialized minorities in California especially, this is not a new conversation. So what I really hope to do in some ways is using one particular example of a community where I've definitely organized, a community I know well, but I'm really hoping to hear some of your experiences, just hear some of your thoughts, things that you're thinking about. You know, anti-Asian violence in general has also been sort of centered in a big way after certain recent incidents, especially in Los Angeles and the Bay Area. And so I'm really just hoping to, you know, sort of have a intellectual conversation, dialogue, and you know, explore together, because there are no easy answers to these subjects and what we're talking about. Caleb and Christine have generously given about 90 minutes. Don't worry, I will not be talking for 90 minutes, I hope. But I will sort of open it up. We'll kind of, I'm going to just lead us in a kind of a discussion, really, opening some questions, some things I'm thinking about, some things I'm pondering about, and hopefully to get some of your feedback, and then really just to open it up, whether it be for greater explanation, or if it just be just to hear your thoughts and share it together in this intellectual venture of ours that has real life effects. So with that, I'm going to power up my PowerPoint, and away we shall go. And there we go. So, you know, today, you know, as Talib has shared in terms of the course that he is currently teaching, and Dr. Nirvikar Singh, who I saw in the participants list, helped pioneer at UC Santa Cruz, is to look at and expand the field of Sikh studies. We're going to be looking in certain ways of cross sections between like ethnic studies, local studies, and in some ways even how these give us different insights in terms of the subject that we're going to be exploring about. And again, as I keep emphasizing, I'm really excited to hear and from what you all are thinking, and what you all are experiencing, and how you approach these, you know, in California today in 2021. So I'm going to be talking about white supremacy in the Golden State. As I shared, I'm going to center certain Sikh experiences, but the conversation may end up going in many different directions. So just so you know a little bit where I'm going to be starting, where I'm going to be going, and then really how we open it up is I'm going to talk a little bit in the beginning about an earlier history. You know, you have to think about not something like white supremacy or racialized violence just as something that is just always is, but to also think of how this is produced, when it's produced, who produces it. And so those are some of the questions that we're going to be talking about. And as I said, there is a link with the past. I'm also going to hopefully talk a little bit about a transnational history, in the sense that, especially in settler colonial states, there are ways that, especially in a community that imagines itself as diasporic as the Sikh community, where things that are happening in England and Canada, for instance, are seen as local as you know, Los Angeles or Orange County, or at least they're imagined that way. There are ways that communities, and especially communities that think of themselves as diasporic communities, tell stories, how stories are shared, how stories are remembered, and also stories, how stories are forgotten. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of responses to white supremacist violence in the present, and explore sort of how do we think of these things? How are these things being imagined in the community? Are there similarities in your own experiences, or just for you as a young person in 2021? How are you? How do these things make sense or not make sense to you? So I'm going to start with a tragedy, actually. So Paramjit Singh, and I had actually the opportunity on numerous times now to meet his nephews. It's a story about the Bay Area. So Paramjit Singh came here as an immigrant about 15 years ago. Used to live in the Bay Area. Due to housing affordability issues and it just no longer being viable for him, him and his family ended up moving to Tracy. It was actually a sort of a individually sort of a low income family, but they were able to, during that move to Tracy, a couple of the family members became involved in truck driving, and that gave them sort of new access. Paramjit Singh came at an older age, so he was largely, even in, until the time of his passing when he was 64, he was working actually at the Amazon Fulfillment Center in Tracy. And in some ways, Tracy, which used to be part of the sort of Central Valley and probably still is by location, in some ways has a new relationship with the Bay Area, especially with regards to the lack of affordable housing. So Paramjit Singh on August 25th, 2019, so we're just talking about a year and a half ago, he was out just taking an evening stroll that he did all the time. In that particular community, and I did get a chance to visit in Tracy, there's actually a very large Sikh community, oftentimes with stories very similar to that of Paramjit Singh's. It's a relatively affluent area of Tracy, at least if one is to look at the home values. But on that particular evening, while walking, he was confronted by a particular young person and was actually brutally murdered. He was stabbed to death with multiple lacerations, and ended up bleeding to death there just at the park, literally a few blocks away from his house. On the evening when it happened, when the police came to inform the family, within 24 hours they had let the family know that they were able to apprehend a perpetrator relatively quickly. They had video surveillance because it was a nearby elementary school, and they were able to do kind of other things to identify some possible suspects. They told actually the family that the alleged perpetrator actually had affiliations, and very well-known affiliations, with certain white supremacist groups, especially within San Joaquin County, but especially in Modesto. Subsequently, just to sort of catch you up on the case, what ended up happening was before the charges could even be made, the judge actually looking at the evidence dropped the case for insufficient evidence. And in some ways, that's actually where the case stands today. But since we're also talking about responses, I have to share sort of how did at least the Sikh community, and in some ways the broader Tracy community, how did it begin to mobilize, or how did it think to even organize? And in some ways, what are the logics, especially in the United States, that certain communities that seek to conform to a model minority politics, how do they do so? So very quickly, Paramjit Singh's the story of his murder spread very rapidly in the community, especially through social media. People were sharing it on Facebook, obviously Twitter, Instagram, and whatnot. And there was a desire, probably within 48 hours, that there would be some sort of memorial, some sort of coming together as a community. Right away, it was a very strange sort of gathering. It happened at the park, the same park where he was murdered, and just 48 hours in advance. Large sections of the community came. People drove from Sacramento. I drove from Fresno. People came from as far as Bakersfield, because there was some feeling that there needed to be people to come together. Very quickly, that the particular event, I would say, sort of local Sikhs in Tracy, largely that either had relationships with the state or were seeking some role in local, like candidates, especially that were seeking some role in local politics, very quickly sort of took the mic. Um, and in some ways, it was a very kind of strange sense, because very few people actually talked about Paramjit Singh. A couple of his family members did, but largely those that became sort of in Punjabi parlance, what we sometimes call the stage secretary, really were just thanking the police, actually. And it was a very strange thing, because at least at that particular point, while the police had a suspect, they had not apprehended anybody. There may be larger conversations that we have to talk about in terms of what are the implications in terms of like a racialized carceral state, and the such reliance on policing as the only form of an understanding of justice. But speaker after speaker after speaker, it was to thank the Tracy community, and and especially thank the Tracy police. And for a lot of young folks that were kind of sitting there and thinking through it, I think that became kind of a sort of strange incident. There was no anger, and generally speaking, there was an underlying anger, but each speaker that would come up would say, "We cannot be angry. And in Punjabi they would say, we must thank the police." In fact, and for the family who I've gotten to know, I think right away they felt kind of in a very strange position. I asked them after the event. I said, well, what did you think about that? What did you reflect on it? And they were saying, we're new immigrants. We really don't know what to say, so we have to trust these Punjabi or Sikh elected officials, or in that particular case in Tracy, these particular people that were interested, these candidates interested in running. And in some ways, we kind of defer our position to them. So what sort of happened subsequently to that? As I shared, the judge ruled that the police had not gathered enough evidence. They ended up dismissing the charges against the young individual that they had identified as a person that was in the vicinity of the area during the time of the crime. Of course, the San Joaquin County's DA shared, the disappointment in dropping the charges, and really sort of the only lasting effects were those oftentimes candidates at the time. So some have actually gone on to become local electeds. Actually, just they thought it was really important to, in some ways, wed Sikh symbolism with the state, and I guess this is very common in sort of model minority politics. And they put up these adopt a highway signs, saying we need to come together to serve the community. And you can see this sort of vision of a kind of star-spangled banner turban. This you can actually see it if you're ever driving. That would be west on west on the 580 through the Bay Area from Tracy towards the Bay Area, and you'll see one of these that says 6 of Tracy, 6 of Mountain House, and they do, like, obviously with the Adopt a Highway, they do cleanings every month. And from that sort of section of the community, that just became the end of it. And I think for a lot of young people, a lot of people trying to think through this in a very different way, and really kind of centering sort of solidarities and learning from other communities, I think there was a deep sense of anger, frustration in terms of how a model minority politics really limits your scope of action, and almost begins to have its own sort of rhetoric of how you're even allowed to even talk about such incidences. And so I kind of wanted to start with that story, just because it was so fresh. It was something that where I had an opportunity to participate, but also have subsequently got to know the family very well, and get to understand how their own sentiments, and a lot of young people's sentiments in Tracy and beyond, who have a very different view. So I have to start with an earlier history here, and this may be, and I did get to look at Talib's syllabus. So this may be something that you're all thinking about in terms of your class. That what is an earlier history of well, in this particular case, we're talking about the Sikh community, whether we're talking about South Asians or Asian Americans in general. And for the Sikhs, it actually dates back as early to the turn of the 20th century. We have those that came via Angel Island, that were first detained in Angel Island off near San Francisco, as early as the 1890s. And really, it's a conversation, in terms of cheap labor, seeking opportunities that were not available, in Asia. In this particular case, in colonial British, British India, and in terms of what was the situation, what were the violences, and what were the economic prospects that they were hoping for and searching for. The tale of the early community. Oftentimes they were engaged, especially in agriculture, and in California, if we're talking about the Sacramento and San Joaquin valleys, in the lumber yards, and also similar to the Chinese community in terms of involvement with the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. So things that were considered extremely dangerous, could be very low paying, and actually rife in terms of exploitation. That this was sort of the early history of the community. But it is interesting because even in the face of severe kind of racialized violence. I mean, you saw the rise of various sort of anti-Asian groupings, especially in California, and many were also specifically aimed at the South Asian community, oftentimes called Hindu at the time, although they were overwhelmingly of Sikh or Muslim backgrounds. But for an early population, right away they made a connection that that the violence that was being produced and that they were often being subjected to, and it could be terrible violence. We're talking about physical threats. We're talking about death. We're talking about sundown towns in terms of where people can live and not. There was multiple stories that we have of Sikhs being murdered, especially in the Live Oak and nearby sort of Yuba City areas during the early part of the 20th century. You see what occurs when you lose your citizenship and the denaturalization. In some ways, most famously in 1920 with the Bhagat Singh Thind case at the Supreme Court. You saw loss of land through the Asian Land Exclusion Act, constant destruction of property. So you're seeing a kind of a full production of violence, really institutionalized and concentrated in a way that even for us, in the 21st century, sometimes can be hard to imagine. But in terms of the community then, although much smaller than it is today, when they were beginning to think of different ways to combat, to confront the violence that they were oftentimes undergoing, they saw that there was a direct connection in terms of an anti-imperial struggle, that that the where in this particular case, India stood in the global economy as a colonized land, was immediately had an immediate connection and link to how new immigrants were being treated in the United States. And oftentimes, the struggles that they saw and the connections that they made were oftentimes rooted in class. And so, for instance, there one particular formation that, and I saw that it was mentioned in the syllabus prior, was with the Ghadar Party, where the Ghadar Party actually the kind of even the institutions that where they held their very first meetings in Ogden, or sorry, in Astoria. Oregon, was actually at a Finnish socialist hall. And actually, they were even supported and given early money even by some Finnish socialists, even in that area, where some of the early Gadars, like Sonsing Paknan and others, were residing at the time. So I'm going to obviously come to the present, but I want to kind of really highlight this sort of anti-imperialist sort of sentiment and thoughts and connections in terms of how people were perceiving white supremacy. When we that was something that's also while it can be produced locally, there are ways that there are currents that are happening internationally and globally. And they were and for those that were directly confronting this violence, they were aware of it and making those sort of connections even at the time. Different people took different approaches, even even at that time in the early part of the 20th century. And even going to the second half of the 20th century, there were those that were advocating legal reforms. There were those that were seeking challenges in the court. I cited Bhagat Singh Thiнд's example earlier, and there was a lot of certain sort of language in terms of how one becomes an ideal citizen. If you look at, for instance, the Stockton Gurdwara, which was first opened in 1912, there was a lot of language in the in when they were sorry, what's the right word there? When they were presenting their paperwork to have the institution recognized, about being an ideal citizen, about being a role model citizen, about not being a public charge, and that sort of language, especially during the Trump administration, has really re-entered our lexicon. They're kind of having this idea of sort of a good immigrant, Black immigrant. I think sort of anti-Blackness sort of informs, especially this real push in the early conversations about not being a public charge, being hardworking, and so much of this language has actually become so internalized within the community even today. But we can see really the beginnings of that much early in the first half of the 20th century. But there were those that were looking at this slightly different. There were those, as I shared, that were looking for links between racism abroad, imperialism, and racism within the United States. There were those that were directly challenging white supremacist groups, and most often the police, that were often seen as that direct arm. We have numerous accounts of sort of what they were called, like some of the newspapers called riots, where while the ones most commonly cited, like in Bellingham in Washington, often were where the police colluded with sort of white supremacist vigilante groups to create death and destruction of property of South Asian immigrants. There are a few examples that we've been able to find where actually they even police headquarters were actually attacked in the Central Valley. So very early on, there was an understanding that the police, local police, oftentimes serve as a in direct collusion with these sort of white supremacist vigilante groups. And what was also sort of interesting in terms of just, I had a chance to sort of do some, I guess you could say, a little bit of oral history, talking to just folks that had been here and who came very early. They oftentimes shared a role in terms of desegregation that was oftentimes played by youth, and sometimes even those that may have had some relationship with criminality in being able to desegregate spaces that had been traditionally segregated. Um, so these were all sort of key components in some ways of an early reaction, here at least in California, to the experiences that they were undergoing, with the extremely powerful arm of the state backing of certain sorts of white supremacist violence. So I want to talk about that as a certain sort of pool or repository where people have always drawn from, but it definitely was not the only one. So as I shared in the introduction, when I was talking a little bit about the contents, in the Sikh community that very much sees itself as a diasporic community, oftentimes it will draw from other areas as well, and where areas that could be on the other side of the globe are also discussed about in a very sort of local way. In these particular cases that I'll be highlighting in other sort of settler colonial states, and well, especially Canada, in the UK it's a little bit of a different, in the United Kingdom it's a little bit of a different relationship, but how even stories there of certain confronting white supremacist violence are used and imagined by youth today. So what I wanted to especially draw a highlight to was really in the you following the the bombing of London and the bombing throughout Britain following World War II. You had large numbers of South Asian immigrants later go to and settle in the UK, really to rebuild the country. You had large numbers of people starting to go in the 1960s. And oftentimes you started having ethnic, as the parlance, at least in the UK, of Asian enclaves. There, whether they be in the Midlands, especially in areas like Wolverhampton and Birmingham, and most celebrated, at least when the Punjabi Sikh community is on the western side of London. There's a borough called Southall, not too far from Heathrow Airport, if any of you have ever been, where you had a large sort of ethnic enclave of largely Punjabi immigrants grow. But during that same time, you had certain British politicians talking oftentimes of the need to get rid of these immigrants that are destroying the country. They oftentimes invoked language like rivers of blood. If this sounds familiar, that's probably not by mistake. You had sort of on the ground groups that oftentimes, again, were supported by local police there in the UK, oftentimes called the National Front. And at least in the UK, there became direct violence and actually rioting between both groups, where the National Front would oftentimes try to host events in Southall provocatively in the midst of these like Asian communities to assert themselves, and the community would actually and after a number of deaths, it wasn't that it happened right away. There were a number of key murders that actually had happened along the way before really, especially amongst the youth, that had reached such a boiling point where they thought they could only confront violence with violence as well, especially in the midst of including police. And that, if anyone's interested, there's a great documentary on the Southall youth movement. You can find it on Vimeo, YouTube, and whatnot. And I think there's also, at least in the United States, oftentimes in terms of those that are thinking about this sort of transnational history, oftentimes we look at these older immigrant communities to draw from. And Canada in the 1970s and 80s is also one that is oftentimes invoked, where there were clear class-based solidarities, really kind of working with, especially working class Chinese communities, especially in British Columbia, to confront certain sort of white supremacist violence, especially in British Columbia and others in Ontario as well. So, as one can travel back in time, but one can do that in terms of when you're trying to evoke and invoke memories and histories. But there's different ways you can do that, whether that be in a particular geography or in some ways going outside and beyond specific geographies. And oftentimes when I'm having conversations with young folks or those that are kind of most talking about this issue, whether that be on the case of Paramjit Singh or others, these are oftentimes references that are more and more that are included. And sometimes you can figure out somebody's politics by which histories they may also exclude. So if we begin kind of bringing it forward into this particular moment, these were just some headlines that I grabbed in the last week. So this is not something that I'm just that I had to like look far in a news Google search. But today we're talking in a big way again. I was sharing after certain well-publicized incidences in the Bay Area, especially. We're starting to talk about anti-Asian violence, especially even prior to the global pandemic we're in, where people, and that's part of an older history too, of how people weaponize public health and to sort of produce certain sort of racialized stigma that can lead to violence, in terms of how even this pandemic, which geographies were being highlighted and why. So we're talking about anti-Asian hate crimes or violence in a big way again. So whether again after these certain instances in the Bay Area, but also reports showing that we've seen increases in incidences, especially in certain metropoles where, and one can ask why, but why people make the assumption that should not be in those areas where there's large communities exist. I put two other headlines just really from the last week, these don't fit easily within language, sometimes as simple as a hate crime, oftentimes because it's also where intersections of sort of class, certain forms of exploitation, certain forms of entrepreneurship sort of coexist, where you had these sort of two high-profile sort of deaths within the Sikh community, both involving store owners that were killed while doing their job. One being in Utah that happened 2-3 days ago, and this the other one in Sacramento a little bit over a week ago. So as I want to sort of open this up to the discussion and want to be mindful to optimize our time together, is really to kind of think about how is white supremacist violence produced in terms of the communities that often see that are kind of on the front edge where these conversations are most often happening. We tend to give a special precedence to the second one I listed in terms of national institutions, that people talk about the rhetoric of specifically people in especially during the Trump administration, where it was just the case where it was the most obvious. But I want to kind of talk a little bit, maybe less about that one, although maybe maybe in our discussion we'll raise that again. But a little bit more, I think, in terms of our local institutions, in the sense that we've talked about the police, and hopefully we continue to talk about the police, but in some ways, in terms of my own experience, where I've had an opportunity, and Talib shared that, where I'm on a local school board, how many sort of implicit assumptions are made. Our county board of supervisors, wherever you go in California, oftentimes are places where racialized sort of asymmetries in power, racialized violence, especially in terms of resource allocation and which areas get choked off from any resources, where those oftentimes decisions are made. And also, if we talk about sort of the most in your face forms, where you have sort of like white supremacist gangs and groups, where a lot of times their activities are condoned. And so really to think about sort of the way local institutions in some ways are at the kind of sword's edge in terms of where these sorts of violences are produced and reproduced. I'm hoping we talk a little bit, in terms of connections with class. More often than not, and the Southern Poverty Southern Poverty Law Center has put together various mappings in terms of white supremacist groups. What's really interesting is, especially if you map the ones in California, the ones where you see the most active groups are actually in quite affluent areas. So this easy conversation times people have in terms of where people make about sort of the way class or white supremacist violence goes together is often goes into the face about in terms of what are our easy assumptions. Oftentimes it's in affluent areas. There's a direct tie there in terms of the local institutions, whether we're talking about county board of supervisors or otherwise. Of how this occurs. I was recently talking to a person that who was actually attacked in sort of the Antelope area of Sacramento, which is an affluent area, while he was out for an evening. So it's in some ways it actually kind of makes sense, but it's something I'm hoping that, like, when we open this up in just a few minutes, that's something we talk about. Really in the same ways how even these responses, especially sort of a model minority response, how it's always informed by anti-Blackness, of how in the logics of a white supremacist, how much even other communities internalize that in order to advance, essentially in a sort of zero-sum logic. And then really want to talk about sort of what solidarities you all see that are possible. I'm happy to kind of share where a lot of things are actually happening, especially in the Central Valley and other regions beyond. But it's really that hard conversation of bringing communities together, having people get to know each other, especially we live in such overlapping residences and regions. What does that look like? How has that looked? What are people are thinking about? You've seen in some ways, probably most explicitly, where with a recent movie about Fred Hampton that came out about the Black Panthers. So it was sort of interesting because I've seen, especially in the Bay Area and actually the Jakarta movement, the organization I'm also part of, have tried to seek different answers to certain sorts of white supremacist violence that go beyond just invocations of more policing. And so to look at community defense in new and interesting ways, and to start conversations with community groups, especially from the 60s or 70s, that experimented with innovative ideas around sort of community self-defense. So these are all sort of questions that I'm hoping, and I'll put my information on the back. But I wanted to open this up to really just to hear from the students, like what are questions that I asked that might have evoked a response from you, and really just to kind of open this conversation, this dialogue even further. So thank you for that. And I'm excited to go out of my share screen so I can see if any questions have come up in the chat box. So thank you.
Deep, thank you so much for that really thought-provoking and historically layered presentation. We appreciate it so much. There are a number of questions right now in the Q&A, and Talib and I will help moderate these. Talib, do you want to begin with the first question? And would you mind stating who it's from?
Yeah, sure. I'm actually going to combine the first two, ones from Michaela and the second one's from Neelam. The first one is, do you think that teaching religions and cultures in early education would help with discrimination? And Neelam's kind of discusses that too by asking, how would you recommend we educate the public about hate crimes against the Sikh community? And here, Neelam's picking up on how social media is a great way for maybe youth, but how would you, spread that word for older generations or people not using social media?
No, I think these are great questions, Michaela and Neelam. In terms of how I think about it, you know, so so I love where both of you are coming, and I'm going to say we're probably where I agree, and I think also maybe where I've started to, I'm trying to think in new directions. So, when I talk about sort of like a model minority sort of approach to this sort of violence, it oftentimes takes a certain sort of form. And the form is almost pre-created before you even and it creates its own circle and its own logics. So whenever these incidences happen within the Sikh community, the first thing is, you know what we have to do is we have to educate more people. They don't know who we are. So hence, therefore, education is the key for us to sort of get out of this. And I think if you broaden your conversations, and to be frank, probably where I've learned the most is actually talking to a lot of our Black-led organization partners and African American groups. They're saying we experience this. It's not that people don't know who we are. There must be something else at play it too. So do I think teaching religions and cultures in early education is important? I absolutely do. Do I quite know if there is a relationship between that and this sort of violence that, and I'm using the word produced on purpose, right? That there are different things that come together to make this happen. And I think that is where I'm probably less convinced that merely teaching something is going to make this more likely or less likely, if that makes sense, because like I said, there's a certain logic to it, but it becomes very circular, this logic, because then anytime something happens, we say, you know what we need is more education. But let's just say we produced, PhD students like Talib that could all, everyone could write dissertations about every community. Would we then see the end of this sort of racialized violence? I don't think so, but I think it's a really important question to ask.
And I wanted to also pose some questions and circle back to the one that Neelam had posed about social media. And so she was asking the question about how to specifically use social media within, the younger generation in order to spread the word about hate crimes. And she poses, so that's part of her question. She actually has another question too, which is a very nuanced one. So on the one hand, she asks, how do we ensure that anti-Sikh crimes, these kinds of violent hate crimes, are not conflated with Islamophobia? But at the same time, how do we ensure that our response is not Islamophobic? The defense being like, "We're not Muslim," and so, and instead uplift both communities.
I think that's a really important question. So where I saw that actually most Neelam was actually soon following 9/11, where you saw exactly that, where just days after 9/11, there was a store clerk in Arizona, Balbir Singh Sodhi, who was murdered. And in that response, there was a certain desire in the Sikh community initially to circle the wagons, and it was interesting because it was very intergenerational of how this actually argument started to play out, and a lot of it also had to do with certain sort of immigration experience. Differing between those that had immigrated to the country and oftentimes their children that were born here, or those that had immigrated at a far younger age. And so the initial reaction was to say, we are not Muslims. And that became a certain sort of response. You all may not be old enough to remember emails, newsletters, and these news email groups, listservs. But this was sort of, there was this almost real time in English and in Punjabi, and people were writing in both about what the community response should be. It was largely what we sometimes term the sort of like 1.5 generation, those that oftentimes came when they were younger, maybe in their elementary or sort of pre-formative years. That's where you saw actually the biggest pushback. Now, we can talk about sort of what would it was like to wrap oneself in the flag, especially after 9/11. But that one was sort of won out, where they said, we're not going to demonize one group with a sort of we are not Muslim sort of argument, but why don't we create something called like we are all American? Now, there's still somebody included or excluded in any of these sorts of conversation, but that one sort of won out. And that tension, Neelam, that you ask about still exists, because it goes to that question, Michaela and you both posed earlier in terms of, is education the what is at play in terms of the production of certain sort of white supremacist violence? Because for some, they do believe it's a question of education. So they say, oh, it's a mistaken identity. They really meant to target somebody else, but we just happen to be who they're targeting. But I think one has to kind of look at this a little bit deeper. Like I said, I reflect on a lot of the Black-led orgs that we partner with, where they're like, yeah, for us, it's not really about education. There's something else. But people know who we are. We still suffer. There seems to be something else at play, and one has to take how that violence, and that's why I was trying to talk about local institutions, national institutions, a little bit more, economics, class, a little bit more seriously, because if we're going to think through this and get through this together, and we're only going to do it if we do this together, we have to face that sort of head on, and that just education may not be the answer.
Yeah, thanks. That reminds me a lot about, obviously, the reaction to the 2012 Oak Creek massacre, right? This whole mistaken identity and trying to distinguish one group from the other. Thanks for that. We have a question from Bradley here.
Well, actually, Talib, let me I just want to comment on that. So that one was super. Then we'll go to Bradley's question. That one was super interesting too, because so the particular person that orchestrated those murders, nobody ever got to question them or have a conversation with them. But it was sort of interesting. A lot of people brought up. So that particular individual, Wade Michael Page, was also a truck driver. So there were people that were asking the question, and I think Sikhs become uncomfortable with it, that what if he knew he was going into the Gurdwara? What if he didn't think at all he was ever going to a masjid or mosque? Does that change anything? Does that mean something different? And I don't know why, but there's a even to ask that simple question within the Sikh community, it creates some sort of unease. But to me, especially in large locales throughout the Central Valley, people know who you are. I'm not saying they can write an essay on your community in order to expect them, but what if there is the production of violence and hate is against you and not just a mistaken identity.
Yeah, thanks for that. So Bradley's question is about Paramjit Singh, actually, and he's asking what might a local or political response that was not rooted in anti-Blackness look like, and he clarifies later as in deviating from the model minority response.
Could I ask a follow-up to that as well, Deep?
Yeah.
You know, what would a response look like that also doesn't in some way contribute to the erasure of anti-Asian violence, you know?
No, I think that's a really important kind of question to add on top. You know, I, I'm actually hoping to sort of just think through this out loud in some ways with you all. You know, it was clear, and the family itself felt that even their expression of anger, rage, hurt, frustration was being prescribed by people that were only seeking to, or rather inscribed by people that were seeking to say, we don't want to say anything about the police. We don't want to say anything negative. You know, our image is extremely important, even in this particular moment in time. I think, you know, it's really to talk to different communities, community-based groups, you know, really to sort of think about what would be the future of a Tracy that they're trying to think about. And I don't think that happened enough. I think when these incidences happen, uh, and understandably so, your first interactions are with the organs and institutions of the state. And then you begin to only think in terms of that could be the only place of where this envisioning is happening. And then it creates its own logics of, okay, do we need more arrests? Do we need harsher laws? And that may be that may be, and one can explore it, but we also know that that particular history has always affected racialized minorities much more than whatever reasons that it may be invoked, right? So we're talking you know, after the January 6th events in Washington, D.C., there are those that are saying, no, this is where we need domestic terror laws and in terms of how they're who they go against and who they're used against. But you see actually a lot of Muslim community groups, and to be frank, a lot of actually groups that have been most on the front of this have actually been Japanese American groups, and also Black-led organizations that have said, like, let's think about this, because it's very easy to give this as a knee-jerk answer, but more often than not, you know, that's not how those laws are going. Those are not the people that those laws are going to be applied against. And as we know from those that even went to, you know, Washington D.C. in January 6th, they were school board members. They were you know, local officials. These were people from affluent backgrounds. These were not whatever might have been, you know, the QAnon shaman or what, you know, some of these, like, you know, kind of images, but that was not the majority of the people that actually showed up that day.
The next question is from Gunit Hora, who asks the question of whether the United States has ever extended any form of reparations to the Sikh community for violence past or present, either through compensation, a shift in policies, any other form. I guess I would extend this and just ask you if there has ever been any kind of state-sponsored solution that has ever been proposed that in any way accords with a sort of horizontal imagining of justice?
So I mean, the easy answer, Guneet, is no. but I think where to Christine sort of thinking in terms of how we can imagine this. Now, when we talk about reparations in the United States, the community we're most sort of talking about, it tends to be, of course, the African American community, especially the descendants of those that were enslaved. In terms of you know, this sort of or in some ways, maybe we're also talking about sort of you know, that sort of colonial settler violence and land seizure and the death and destruction of our native communities. So neither in those like these kind of broad sort of founding violences have we really seen conversations really been uptaken by the state to think through these. So it definitely has not happened in the Sikh community, where you've seen some acknowledgement, at least, was of course with the interning of Japanese Americans during World War II. But you know, I think when I read certain you know, like there's a number of actually economic professors that I'm thinking about, Sandy Darity, especially in terms of who has really sort of trying to think about sort of what does reparations mean? Like what does how have other states and beyond just Nazi, not, you know, Germany, you know, following the Nazis, but how have other states attempted to deal with historic injustices, but that are not just rooted in the past, right? That continue to reproduce themselves, and so much of the present can only be understood by historicizing that sort of violence. So it has not necessarily happened within the Sikh community. To be frank, I don't think I'm holding my breath there, but I think there is something that for those that sort of historic founding violence, and even those of us that have transposed ourselves onto this land, and whether we like it or not, we are the inheritors of that as well in some form or manner. What role do we have in advancing that sort of conversations for a country, for ourselves, to look squarely at that violence and what it means?
Thanks. The next is a comment and a question from Jane. And she writes, "Thank you so much for this presentation. I learned so much. I would be curious to hear more, if you're willing, about how you navigate the tensions in the diaspora in your own organizing. How do you respond to model minority organizing paradigms, and where do you think we should focus our attention instead? What organizing projects are you working on right now?"
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Jane. I think you know, one always has to have sort of an uncomfortability in terms of with oneself, in terms of whatever one is doing. I think you hopefully not to the point where it leads to inaction, because inaction itself can perpetuate inaction. But I think it's really just kind of constantly questioning, you know, what are my assumptions coming in before, you know, trying to think through, talking to as many people I can share, is like, the more people you talk to, and not just within a specific ethnic or community group, but really sort of thinking about other experiences, you know, you know, as I've probably repeated a few times now, and a lot of it has to do with my own personal friendships, but also has to do with the orgs that I work so closely with, which tend to be a lot of Black-led orgs. And so then so many of those kind of assumptions that where I come in, and like I said, when you get into these like circular logics, here you have a community that's been here much longer. You know, you have a community that has had a very different history, but also just a certain sort of just extremely diverse experiences within the confines of this country, and in terms of its interactions with the state. So there's just so much to learn when you get an opportunity to interact. I mean, maybe a little bit less this year, but hopefully you'll all be on campus next year. But I really sort of recommend talking to your fellow students, joining a different organization, finding ways to sort of cross collaborate. I learned so much from that. So, to your question of how do I navigate those tensions? How do I try to respond outside these sort of model minority paradigms? It's really that, because there isn't a book, there isn't a scripted answer. It's just this constant learning, but constantly questioning yourself, and being willing to take a risk to try to advance a new conversation, or try to go into a different direction.
Yeah, Deep, it's so interesting to hear you speak, because you spoke about the sort of post 9/11, um, urgency of draping oneself in the flag, and many people have written about that and how that represents a certain kind of form of national security. But there is something about, you know, what you're talking about, like even the supposed mistaken identity, where it actually doesn't even really matter, because at the root of that kind of form of racism is a consent to securitization of people, which is a sorting of supposedly good into bad, with us against us. And that is a kind of form of structural violence, and that seems to just be to understand securitization as a form of racialization that is predicated upon exclusion at the point of violent exclusion for others is really what's at stake. So I wanted to, and I appreciate what you're saying too, in response to what Jane was saying, that against the sort of shield that comes with the model minority sort of myth is the willingness to undertake risk, you know? Yeah, and so we have a question from Lily Marks. She asks, what would be a form of direct action outside of public protest to fight hate crimes and white supremacy?
That's a great question, Lily. I now I'm just spitballing with you, because I don't have an answer now. When we're thinking about, especially the sort of most explicit forms of white supremacist violence, even when it has its own logics in the police, when we saw sort of the uprising this past summer, without public protest, I don't think we would be having I don't think we'd having some shift in terms of the conversation that we're seeing. Um, so like that's definitely one part I definitely want to center, is to say that is definitely something to learn, is you do need a very public part of a protest. Can that be the in and of itself? No, but I've seen without that, you don't have any movement either. What I was sharing with the Paramjit Singh case very early, when people came together, they weren't protesting. So it actually wasn't clear what people were doing. We were coming together, but because there was a certain sort of model minority logic where we did not want to actually confront, we didn't want to confront anybody, to be frank. Like, neither the police, neither the state, neither people didn't want to say, talk about white supremacy. In fact, most of the invocations was to thank the police for whatever actions was doing. So, sometimes there has to be some sort of confrontational or something that you're opposing, if for no other reason, to give your whatever movement or justice you have some sort of thrust in a direction, because otherwise it can become mangled, and you're not quite sure what you're doing. Like you're coming together. That has an importance, but not always clear for what. So I definitely want to kind of center that the importance of, and the word protest is important, because you I have seen that you definitely do need that. Now, outside of that, I think that's where we're all still figuring out. I mean, I've definitely shared in terms of places where I've seen a lot of this violence produced, especially in California, at your county board of supervisors levels. On your, we had a police reform commission in Fresno following, actually, or rather in light of the incidences, the uprising from the summer. And that's where I saw, like, there are real economic interests in keeping the status quo. Like amongst younger people that were on this on that particular panel, or rather that particular commission, sorry, all of us were like, took certain things for just granted, in terms of like that we all have a stake in some sort of greater racial justice and less police brutality. But we like, I think many of us learned, some more surprised, some less so, that there are vested interests, especially economic interests, especially class interests, in terms of the status quo. That it's not just, oh, old people will just die and then things will be better. No, there's real economic interests that are vested in terms of the carceral structure and the policing structures that we have.
So I think we have time just for one last question, and this also comes from Lily, actually, and she asks if there's a difference in Sikh hate crimes in lower income communities versus wealthier ones.
So, so the difficulty, Lily, sometimes using the word hate crime is there's a legal meaning, and then there's oftentimes sort of common parlance, like just how we talk and use it. So within the Sikh community, the word hate crime is used a lot. Now, without going too much into like Afro-pessimism, I think one has to sort of also look at, like, for a lot of immigrant communities, oftentimes within the logics of how, especially when you have little capital, can you potentially get more capital? Oftentimes it is by exploiting the most oppressed and marginalized communities. So oftentimes, and when there were conversations a couple of years ago when they were talking about the LA uprisings, right? Looking at sort of what were the dynamics between the Korean community and the Black community. So in this particular context, in where I was sharing that, certain store owners, right, that are oftentimes, we call them store owners, but oftentimes their biggest sales are around liquor and tobacco, that are oftentimes in low income communities as well. So oftentimes there is destitution, which does not absolve the individual, but I think one can't lose that sort of context of like where those things are more likely to occur, period. And I think one has to have a response with that, like a really community grounded response of getting to know your residents and your neighbors, so that there isn't just a feeling that certain people come, they drive to their place of business, but don't have real commitment and investments in that community and then leave. I think one has to think through that and really engage with that. What I'm talking about in terms of what it looks like in wealthier communities, like I said, the people on January 6th were not people coming from the most oppressed parts of marginally destitute regions. More often than not, they were coming from the wealthier classes. That's a big, I have definitely seen at the local level. That's kind of a, where we talk about there's a thing in the media about the big lie about how the 2020 elections went. But part of that is that, part of the big lie is that I always see is like where people say that the most destitute classes were the ones that voted, for instance, for Trump. That hasn't actually been my experience in terms of engagement with people. You forget most working classes are actually people of color. But in terms of it really was those that are the sort of country club, sort of going people where this idea of a loss of status, and it's not just amongst the sort of at the lowest level where like on the economic ladder where people focus on. I think there's a real anger, especially of those where this system has served the best. That's why there's a real anger about things called cancel culture. You all probably hear about these debates, or like, what sort of conversations are allowed on campuses and not. Sometimes I don't know, and it'd be interesting to hear some of your opinions, in the comment or question box. But I think some of that is they're perceived that they may lose a status that invokes such vitriol and really helps produce, whether it be through economic means, through rhetorical means, through just giving a space, through pulling back of policing on certain groups to allow that sort of thing, to that kind of sentiment to fester that elites have. And that's what I mean, where those that were most supportive of sort of this sort of white supremacy, it was not coming from the lowest necessary classes of working white communities. It was very much the case of actually upper white groups, and I think we have to, and to be honest, I've actually seen a lot of new alignments. I think Talib and I think we're joking about it too, where I've seen especially second generation youth born here, especially young men, children of immigrants, also trying to be kind of like edgy, trying to that have also, and a lot of, for them, I notice it comes out of like misogyny, whatever their like patriarchy, their own perceived losses of status, especially vis-a-vis women in their own community, that where I see them oftentimes turning to really be supportive about certain forms of like white supremacist violence, or at least condone it. And that's something that I've definitely seen in the last couple of years.
Deep, Talib and I just want to thank you so much for joining us today, and for being in conversation with us, and I mean us in a sort of broad sense, over a number of years. And thank you for taking the time to speak to the students who are enrolled in CRES 70S. But when you look at the people who attended, and you could see that many people joined from across campus. And I also wanted to thank Shantae Larkins for, setting up the webinar, Lisa Supple and Taylor Ainsley also for lending their support to this. But most of all, our deep gratitude to you for speaking with us. And we just envision being in conversation with you in the years to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christine. Thank you, Talib. Thank you, Shantae, and big thank you to all the students. And I see some faculty like Dr. Sota, Dr. Nirvikar Singh, and others. So thank you so much, and hope to continue this dialogue with all of you, and just stay in touch.
Thank you.